Hello, it's Cried here, with the ultimate guide to Great Katanas in Elden Ring. There are only 3 Great Katanas from the DLC, but all 3 of them are quite good for their own purposes. First, let's start by taking a look at the ranges of the Great Katanas. The infusible Great Katana is the longest one, but not by a whole lot. This will not be the main deciding factor when choosing between the 3 Great Katanas. Next, let's take a quick look at the moveset of the Great Katanas. These are its one-handed and two-handed light attack chain. This is the heavy attack and charged heavy attack of the Dragon Hunter and normal Great Katana. This is the heavy attack and charged heavy attack of the Rakshasa Great Katana, which deals pierce damage instead of slash damage, just as the animation suggests. Surprisingly, even though katanas cannot perform feint attacks by dodging while charging up a heavy attack, the Great Katanas are able to cancel their charged heavies with a feint attack. It is quite the slow feint though. This is the Great Katana's light running attack, which is quite deadly in PvP, thanks to its long reach and pierce damage. This is the heavy running attack. The rolling attack, crouch attack, and backstep attack also uses the poke animation. The light jump attack. The heavy jump attack. The one-handed and two-handed guard counters. This is the power stanced attack chain for the Great Katanas. The power stance running attack. The power stance rolling and crouch attack. The power stance backstep attack. Finally, this is the power stance jump attack. Let's begin discussing the individual Great Katanas, starting with the Dragon Hunter Great Katana. True to its name, this weapon gains a 30% damage bonus against dragons, and a 15% damage bonus against ancient dragons. Additionally, its unique weapon art Dragon Wound Slash deals another 20% extra damage against both dragons and ancient dragons, truly making this weapon live up to its name. You are able to charge Dragon Wound Slash to send out an extended sword aura to greatly extend your range. When you do so, not only will you be doing more damage, the bulk of the damage will be loaded into the ranged sword aura instead of the physical slash. You are still able to hit with the weapon itself, and there's a good reason to do so, because if you only hit with the bullets portion of the weapon art, you're actually doing less stance damage than the uncharged version. But if you hit both the sword aura and the physical sword strike, you'll be doing 33 stance damage instead of 16.5, which is 50% more than 22 stance damage of the uncharged version. It's also not difficult to land the charged version of this weapon art with the 300 hyper armor it grants. Dragon Hunter Great Katana is a quality weapon where you want to invest equally into strength and dexterity to maximize your attack rating. Do remember your 1.5 times strength multiplier if you know you're only going to be two-handing it. Now this Great Katana is great in PvE, especially against dragons. and you can also acquire it early on in the DLC. Optimizing for this weapon can in and of itself be a good build. I don't want to be wasting 10 minutes for such a simple weapon build, so here is the summary. Spam your charged weapon art and run these talismans. The two-handed sword talisman does not work for its weapon art, so when you're fully focused on spamming weapon arts, like in bosses, you can swap it out for the Crimson Seed talisman. Run the Rakshasa armor set too, if you want the most generic looking DLC Great Katana build. Speaking of the Rakshasa's armor set, the Rakshasa's Great Katana is not quite the speculated Oceans of Blood, but its weapon art, Weed Cutter, can be spammed continuously as long as you have resources. It is quite FP efficient, so you're more likely going to be running out of stamina. Not too spectacular of a weapon art versus most bosses, but it does do as its name suggests, cut down trash mobs like weeds. This Great Katana is a dexterity-based Great Katana, so it is best with a full dexterity build. It also has the unique aspect of granting all of its attacks, including its weapon art, running attacks, and feint attacks, etc., some hyper armor. A lot of the attacks grant an additional 77 hyper armor, but the amount depends on the move. Stuff like the charged heavy attack gets even more, at 154 hyper armor, while moves like the rolling attack only gets 57.75. However, this bonus hyper armor comes at a cost. During the hyper armor frames of this Great Katana, you will be receiving 10% more damage taken. For PvP though, hyper armor generally reduces the damage you take by a certain amount. For all of this Great Katana's hyper armor frames specifically, you will receive 7.5% less damage taken. So if you multiply the two together, you're only going to be taking 1.75% more damage in PvP for the additional hyper armor, which is a small trade-off for a great benefit that doesn't usually exist on this weapon type. This hyper armor mechanic, more so than its unique weapon art, is the selling point of this Great Katana. Finally, we have the normal Great Katana. I will also discuss a unique weapon art only available for this Great Katana later. But for now, let's begin with its infusions. These are its heavy and fire infusions. This Great Katana scales a bit better to dexterity, so the keen and lightning infusions shown here have a slightly higher attack. The quality infusion is not great until later into the game when you have more stat points. As you see here, we're barely beating keen infusion despite investing 22 more stat points. These are its flame and sacred infusions, and then its magic infusion. If you want to use this weapon class with a faith or intelligence build, you really only have one choice, and then it's cold infusion. Since there's only one infusible Great Katana, there's only one choice for these status infusions as well. These are its poison and blood infusion. Great Katanas already have base bleed, so remember that the blood infusion overrides the base bleed instead of adding to it. It also means that the Great Katana's occult infusion works pretty well, as occult infusion generally works best only when the weapon has a base status effect that scales to arcane. Now, let's take a look at overhead stance, the unique weapon art available only to the Great Katana. After holding a stance, you can input your light or heavy attack to do either 1 slash or 3 slashes. It does work with the Relana's cameo if you hold it for long enough, but this isn't a great talisman. You must keep the stance up for 1.7 seconds before it works, which means that it's just a crappier Shard of Alexander. Yes, you can stack the both of them, but as Relana's cameo is just a DPS loss, while forcing you to move slowly in the held stance, I wouldn't even bother with it. First, let's look at whether the light or heavy weapon art is more worth using. The heavy weapon art deals more of everything, at the cost of a longer animation. Let's say we're going to be spamming this weapon art. If we convert the damage percent per frame into damage per second, we do see that the heavy version deals more damage, even if it's across 3 hits, which means more reduction from defense. Since the heavy follow-up will be doing twice as much stance damage and more than twice as much status damage without taking twice the animation time, the heavy attack version is superior when we're not in a hurry to quickly hit and dodge. Basically, you want to be spamming the heavy attack follow-up whenever possible. Personally, I think that overhead stance is very similar to weapon arts like the Lion's Claw and the Savage Lion's Claw, except it doesn't get the super armor that these two weapon arts get on the very first frame. So let's do a quick comparison to see if overhead stance is even worth using. Starting with the Lion's Claw, we quickly see that, apart from super armor, the most notable difference is their stance damage versus status damage. One more big difference is their FP cost. Honestly, this is probably the biggest selling point of overhead stance, because as you will soon see, the Savage Lion's Claw does do the job of overhead stance quite well, with the addition of its super armor. After factoring in defense, Savage Lion's Claw has similar DPS as Lion's Claw, and only loses out a bit on stance damage per second, while having a much higher status damage percent per second. Putting overhead stance side by side with Savage Lion's Claw, you can see that you trade quite a bit of stance damage for a bit of status damage. And once again, you also don't have super armor. Also, we're purely comparing these 3 skills for the Great Katana. If it is purely spamming weapon art, both Lion's Claw and Savage Lion's Claw can be equipped on weapons with even higher attack and poise damage. So my biggest suggestion if you're going for overhead stance is to definitely make use of its status damage. And don't get baited by Relana's cameo. Honestly, overhead stance is not especially spectacular, so no need to feel pressured into thinking that this unique weapon art is the best one for the Great Katana, simply because it's unique. Like and subscribe for more weapon breakdowns like this one. If you want to support my work, please consider buying my fantasy novel or donating to my Patreon down below. With a book purchase, you can also request a topic from me. Krite, signing out.